All right. Welcome, everyone. I hope you're all doing well. We're delighted to have so many of you join us today on Global Accessibility Awareness Day for our webinar, You Can't Do It Alone, Building Accessible Products is a Team Sport. My name is Lynette. I'm part of the team here at AnswerLab. Before we begin, just wanted to run through a couple of quick housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded and everyone will receive a recording via email afterward. So if you're disconnected or if we are disconnected, we'll make sure you still receive this content. If you have any questions you'd like to submit, please do so via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And if we have time, we will try and answer them at the end of the discussion. We're going to do our best to keep this to 45 minutes so you can stay on track for your other commitments today. For those of you that aren't too familiar with AnswerLab, we are a full-service UX research company. We provide user experience research, consulting services, and flexible research engagement models to help companies apply a human-centered design process to every product that they launch. Our mission is to help create experiences that people love, and we know that too often, underrepresented groups do not have great digital experiences, so we are on a mission to change that. So with all that said, I'll now hand it over to Carly Pappas, who will be leading our discussion today.
Thanks, Lynette. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining me today. I'm super excited to talk about how to build accessible products with you all. My name is Carly Pappas, and I am a principal UX researcher here at AnswerLab. I'm based in Chicago, and I co-lead our accessibility practice. A little bit about me before we dig in. I have over 10 years experience in qualitative research, with 6 of those years doing UX research. I have led end-to-end user research for development teams, and for the last 5 years, I've specialized in doing research with participants with disabilities and assistive tech users. And I've also worked with a variety of clients to help them build up their accessibility capabilities. Conducting accessibility research has been a big part of our work at AnswerLab for many years. We work with clients across industries to find and solve accessibility issues, build accessibility into their product roadmaps, and to help create great experiences and products for all types of people who use them. Our accessibility subject matter experts have experience across platforms, industries, and populations. Over the last 5 years, I've seen accessibility go from an afterthought at most to a full-fledged initiative at many companies backed by resources and dedicated accessibility professionals. More and more teams are doing this type of research. And according to analysis done by Forrester, 8 in 10 companies are now working to achieve digital accessibility, but there's still a gap. I've worked with many clients that know that accessibility is important and want to address it, but either don't have the support to make progress or don't know how or where to start. And understandably so, because accessibility is a behemoth to tackle. Accessibility has been a trending item in the last couple of years with so much buzz around it. So much information is probably flooding your news feeds, inboxes, and maybe even your team meetings. So how do you find the path through the noise? And that's what we're here to talk about today. I'm going to give you a blueprint to work off of to implement and integrate accessibility within your own team. By the end of this webinar, you should be equipped with real tactics based on your role in the product development cycle to address accessibility. First, take stock of where you are today. Have you started to address accessibility? In what ways are you currently implementing accessibility? What is working well? And what are you struggling with? And as I walk us through how to integrate accessibility over the next several slides, think about where you are today and what your best next step might be with these questions. First, know that accessibility is a journey and not a destination. What often prevents teams and organizations from addressing accessibility is the amount of perceived effort. And at first, it is more work to retrofit or implement accessibility into an already established process and organization. Just like any change or new initiative, implementing accessibility is more work at the beginning when ramping up, establishing processes, and building upon skills. But once that momentum is there, the effort levels out. Things do become easier and faster the more familiar you and your organization become with accessibility. And while it does take more work up front and it can be really daunting, there are ways to mitigate this lift. There are 4 steps to take the overwhelm out of taking your next step, and you'll see each of these points come up throughout the rest of the webinar. So first, recognize you're not alone in this. Accessibility is truly a team sport, and every role shares responsibility. Take comfort in knowing that shared load equals less load. Second, prioritize, allocate, and schedule the necessary time to address accessibility. Even though more and more companies are making accessibility a business priority, according to Forrester, only 36% have a top-down commitment to creating accessible experiences. And I've seen firsthand how accessibility fizzles out if there is no top-down support. There are only so many hours in a day and in a week to work toward goals and commitments. And if accessibility is not scheduled in, it just will simply not be fully addressed and individuals will burn out. So don't start in areas that require you to learn a completely new skill set. Start with areas that you can straddle and focus on adjacent skill sets. And we'll go over exactly what this means in a few slides. Lastly, invest in subject matter experts who can guide and support your team as everyone becomes familiar with accessibility best practices. Now, I know this is all easier said than done. So what does this actually look like in practice? Before we dig into the specifics of each role, let's zoom out a little bit and look at the holistic process and how everything fits together. So accessibility is a team sport, and every role plays a part in building an accessible experience. And these are the main roles in every product development team and their main function as it pertains to accessibility. So first, executive leadership. They prioritize accessibility initiatives at an organizational level. And it's really important that they protect their team's time so their team can focus on addressing accessibility. And it's really important that executives prioritize this for 2 key reasons. The first is to support and give validity to the members of the team that are probably already doing this, but with limited support and resources. This gives them peace of mind and allows them to flourish and really run with accessibility. And second, to motivate and incentivize those who otherwise would not do it on their own. Next, product managers help build empathy for users with disabilities. This is really key in providing the why for your team and helping them to internalize the importance of accessibility. Project managers can draw on user research to help build empathy. And similarly to executive leadership, but on a different level, they prioritize accessibility items for the development team to address. I often hear from developers that they feel that accessibility rests solely on their shoulders and that they don't have the time to fix accessibility issues. But by adding it and prioritizing it in the backlog, the time it takes to fix accessibility issues is accounted for and gives the developers the time they need to thoroughly solve those issues. Researchers ensure that all roles on the team understand the user's context, behaviors, and needs. So basically the what, where, when, and how the user does something and why they do it. The user researcher is the voice for the user, advocates for the users, and tells the story of their experiences with your products and services. Next, content creators write, produce, and publish information. And this could be from headers to button labels, to body copy, to PDFs, to alternative text for images. And it's really key to keep this information simple, clear, concise, and descriptive. It's nice if there's a dedicated role on the team to this content creation, but unfortunately, this responsibility often falls to either marketing, product, or design, or maybe across all 3. Designers then translate and apply accessibility research findings to visual and interaction designs. And lastly, the role that maybe everybody is probably most familiar with in accessibility is developers. And they build designs based on WCAG accessibility success criteria and techniques using consistent, standardized coding practices. The makeup of a robust, effective accessibility practice consists of these 5 key elements. So the first is a central accessibility team comprised of at least 1 point person from each discipline. This team will drive accessibility forward, create and promote accessibility materials, and support other teams in their accessibility maturity. Point persons on this team usually ideally have some experience in accessibility. Now, in addition to this central accessibility team that is, supporting the rest of the organization as the accessibility maturity gets into place, each member of the organization also has a fundamental understanding of accessibility techniques, and their role in accessibility. But they also know that they have support systems, such as central accessibility teams, and know who to turn to for help. So that way they themselves don't feel overwhelmed, and you're also helping to prevent burnout as well. There's also a system in place to surface, triage, and prioritize accessibility issues that fall both within and outside of a team's scope. So I'll often see accessibility issues go unaddressed because the team does not own that element or part of a process. But even if one element is not accessible, then that significantly impacts the user's experience and could either hinder them from using the product or prevent them from completing a task altogether. So it's important that there's not only a system in place within a team to address accessibility, but also a system to surface and prioritize inter-team issues. Fourth, we have UX research that regularly includes users with disabilities that ensures that accessibility stays top of mind. It also helps the rest of the team to become more familiar with users with disabilities needs and contexts of use. And the more familiar everyone is with this context, the more comfortable and confident they are in addressing it. Lastly, collaboration. Collaboration is key. It's so important when implementing something new. So often when there's like an established process in place, you can safely make assumptions about who's doing what and when, but when something is new, it's really important to over collaborate and over communicate even to really make sure everybody's aligned and that everything is accounted for. So include collaborative touch points amongst roles throughout the design and development process, so accessibility implementation is intentional and well considered. These touch points could include upfront planning, during design intent handoffs, or a retrospective, but regardless of what that is, make accessibility an agenda item in all of your meetings, because without accounting for it in your schedule, it will not get addressed. All right, so you know the roles and responsibilities. You have a process in place. Now, how to tackle accessibility from every angle. When building accessible products, there are a number of methods to utilize to ensure an accessible experience, and each has a different purpose and function. So first, user research is one of the first steps I recommend toward building accessible experiences. Compared to some of these other methods listed, it's a much easier and quicker implementation, and it is most effective in building empathy and familiarity with these users. Within your accessibility toolkit, user research ensures an enjoyable user experience. Next, automated testing tools. And these are software that you can run and that identifies accessibility issues based on WCAG guidelines within seconds. Automated audits assess for minimum functionality. So something could be functional, but not really enjoyable or very easy to use. And vice versa, users can complete a task even though the site may not technically meet WCAG standards. So both these automated assessments that are assessing things based on WCAG and user research are needed and should be done continuously throughout the product development lifecycle. So those are two quick and easy things that you can implement relatively quickly into your product development cycle today. Next, we have manual testing with assistive technology. This is a technical assessment, and it is another low barrier to entry way of starting to implement accessibility. Anybody can test out a website using keyword-only navigation. So for instance, pull up any website and start to tab through it, start to arrow through it and see if you can interact and use the page just by using your keyboard alone. If you work off of Mac OS, you can turn on the screen reader voiceover and start to tab through a page and hear how it's being identified and how it's being read by the screen reader. Now, of course, while anybody can start doing this today, and it's actually something that I suggest everybody start to do today, so that way you can start to get a glimpse of what this might really be like for users with disabilities. And so while anyone could do this type of manual testing, it is the most effective when you have an assistive technology expert on your team to do these assessments. Because just like any technology, screen readers, for instance, there are different proficiency levels. So while I can use a screen reader today, the way that I use it and my proficiency with it is going to be vastly different than someone who specializes in this assistive tech. Next, we have heuristics, and these combine expert knowledge of accessibility, WCAG guidelines, and an understanding of assistive tech users' needs and behaviors. So it's similar to automated audits in that the evaluation is based on WCAG guidelines, but it adds another layer of insight if done by someone with deep product and user knowledge. And so this is one of the more time-consuming methods, but it is extremely valuable in identifying issues or maybe surface level issues before going into research, so that a UX research study has the chance to really go deeper into the experience. Lastly, utilize design walkthrough and peer reviews to ensure quality and accuracy and to help each other learn and improve accessibility skills. All right, so we've gone over accessibility from a bird's eye view, and we have a framework and skeleton in place. Now to flesh out each role and dive into specific considerations and tactics you can start incorporating today into your daily and weekly workflows. So beginning with product managers. If you're like most product managers, timelines are critical. And a major theme undertoning this webinar is scheduling accessibility efforts into your timeline and daily and weekly tasks, because without scheduling it in, it won't be addressed effectively. And in order to prioritize accessibility and ensure it receives the consideration that it needs, project managers need to account for user research in their overall timeline and roadmap and accommodate necessary research with participants with disabilities. The second key consideration for product managers is that they should also be aware of accessibility requirements and experiences of participants with disabilities. This understanding will help you to build empathy among your team. So you can also rely on user research and lean on your UXR team members to help you with this. The last 2 points really get at how to incorporate accessibility into your daily and weekly workflows. So the first is to incorporate accessibility acceptance criteria into scenarios into user stories. So by doing this, it begins to address accessibility from the ground up at a foundational level. And by integrating accessibility specific criteria into every user story, this ensures that every feature and every user flow is built with accessibility in mind. Not only is it important to include accessibility acceptance criteria into every user story, but it's also important to add specific accessibility issues as their own user story. So for instance, if an accessibility user issue or bug is identified through the various testing methods we just went over, be sure to also add that bug or issue to the backlog. So you're approaching it from both angles. And then the last point, prioritize time for development teams during sprints to address accessibility. As I mentioned, a lot of the responsibility of accessibility tends to fall on developers, and they're given this requirement without the necessary time to do it. So what I've seen this cause is a reluctancy and a hesitancy to own and execute on accessibility with developers. And so by accounting for the time that it will take during points estimation and prioritizing it in the backlog, this is giving the developers space to comfortably address these issues. So here are some guidelines for writing accessibility acceptance criteria. So by drafting the criteria up front, we are forced to think about accessibility and the range of users, their needs, and circumstances from the start. Accessibility acceptance criteria defines what accessible means in a specific context or for a specific user task, and should be more specific than general accessibility guidelines or checklists. And we're going to go over an example of what that looks like in the next slide. When writing accessibility acceptance criteria, follow these key guidelines. So the first, start with your understanding of accessibility experiences of your users and applicable WCAG guidelines. Your accessibility acceptance criteria are not going to be perfectly honed at first, and they may not cover everything, and that's okay, but start with what you know. It could be as simple as ensuring that information, for example, like a status, is not communicated through color alone to optimize the experience for those who are colorblind. Frame the acceptance criteria in the context of business and user needs. It's not just simply copying and pasting the success criteria defined in WCAG or copy and pasting a design checklist. It is rooting these things in the user's context and defining what an accessible user experience looks like for a specific feature within the user's context. Where they're coming from, the tech that they're using, the circumstances that they're in, their environment in which they're going to be doing this task. And in addition to user needs, accessibility acceptance criteria should also be based on current organizations' needs and known accessibility barriers or common accessibility issues. Third, be specific and focus on measurable outcomes rather than how to implement. Leave that piece up to the developer. Try to avoid terms that overspecify what a type of interaction, such as tabbing, clicking, terms like that. And lastly, just start somewhere with your accessibility criteria. Begin to create a library and reuse common acceptance criteria. Then test that criteria through user research, iterate on it, and fill in gaps as your understanding is expanded. Now, here's a great general example of accessibility acceptance criteria that the UK government's website has provided, and a link to this resource will be shared at the end of this webinar. So this criteria is specifically for this autocomplete field right here of the form. Now, let's take the guidelines from the previous slide and see how they have been applied here. So the first guideline, which is start with your understanding of the accessibility. So let's imagine that you have done user research with participants with low or no vision who use screen readers. And after testing, you know that this field here is functional, meaning that the user can enter into it and provide their street address, like type in their street address. But you discovered during this user research that a screen reader user was not able to use the autocomplete function. And so based on that understanding, you decided to add the following criteria to your story, which is inform the user that autocomplete is available, explain how to use autocomplete, inform the user that content has expanded, inform the user when there are suggestions, or if there are no results. So in other words, you're dynamically providing information based on the changing state. Now let's take the second guideline from the last slide. Frame the acceptance criteria within context and do not just reproduce WCAG guidelines. So if we look at this bottom criteria here, return focus to the editable field when a selected suggestion is confirmed. This correlates to the 2.4.3 WCAG guideline, which is if a web page can be navigated sequentially and the navigation sequences affect meaning or operation, focusable components receive focus in an order that preserves meaning and operability. Okay, so I know what that was a mouthful. So basically what that's saying is that the focus order makes sense for the user and that nothing is like coming as a jarring surprise, that they're placed basically where they would expect to be placed. So notice how this criteria is not being reproduced here, but instead it's being applied based on understanding of the user and the user's context. So in this case, once they've selected an autocomplete suggestion, then they're being placed back on the field so that way they confirm that and then sequentially go down the form. The third guideline from the previous slide said, be specific and focus on a measurable outcome rather than how to implement. And here we have this criteria, inform the user when a selection is confirmed. This is stating what needs to happen, but is not stating how to do it, which will be defined by design and development. And lastly, the last guideline, iterate on acceptance criteria and create an acceptance criteria library. So when you first start, your criteria probably won't be this expansive, and that's okay. But start with a few key known things and then build on out from there. Since we're a consultancy dedicated to UX research, and as a principal UX researcher, we could really get into the weeds here and talk about this in much greater depth. But given our limited time today and the focus of this webinar, I'm going to keep this pretty high level and review the key things to be aware of when beginning to plan and incorporate research with participants with disabilities into your current research practice. So when beginning accessibility research and first defining your participant criteria, recruit primarily on the assistive technology use and then adjacently on the type of disability or impairment. Now, that's because people with disabilities do not often fit neatly into categories. Often people have multiple disabilities or different types of disabilities may present in a similar way, resulting in basically the same endpoint for user research purposes. So I recommend at first recruiting based on the assistive technology device or digital accessibility features used. Next, when you're beginning a research cycle or when you're launching a completely new product, or maybe you're redesigning a product, you'll want to test with a larger sample size. So test with 5 to 6 participants per assistive technology user type or disability segment. So that means testing with 5 to 6 screen reader users, 5 to 6 screen magnifier users, 5 to 6 switch device users, et cetera, which equals a study with a sample of 15 people at a minimum. And that's not including perhaps the other users, general population users you might also be testing with at this stage in development. Also note that these segments, screen reader users, magnifier, switch device, these do not need to be mutually exclusive segments. So often people may be using more than one type of assistive device. And I know that it's not feasible to continuously run research with this sample size, because this sample size would be in addition to your GenPop sample. And this large of a sample is just not always necessary either. So with that in mind, book end user research with larger sample sizes to ensure you're casting a wide net and you're talking to many people of a specific user group. Because just like any technology and any experience, people don't use assistive tech in exactly the same way. They configure the assistive tech settings and set up specifically to their own unique needs and circumstances. Then in the middle iterative stages of product development, recruit based on the general population makeup. So what this means is, and according to organizations like the CDC, about 1 in 4 adults in the US live with a disability. So how this translates to your research study sample is, if you're doing a study of N of 6, aim to recruit 1 to 2 people of that sample with a disability. And then lastly, user research sessions with participants with disabilities usually take a little bit longer because they either need more time to acclimate to a new experience, or if a site was not built accessibly to begin with and not optimized for assistive tech use, it will take longer for the participant to complete a task. So build in time for longer research sessions per study. So for example, to complete roughly 60 minutes worth of content, you want to schedule about 75-minute sessions. And I actually don't recommend going longer than 75 minutes per session, because we also want to account for participant fatigue. And depending on the disability, sometimes going beyond 75 minutes can just be quite daunting, and you really start to see some fatigue settle in after that. Most teams I work with do not realize that research with assistive technology users can be done at every stage of product development. And that's understandable, because how most assistive devices work is they use the backend code to translate functionality in a way that enables a user with a disability to perform an activity that they may have otherwise been unable to do without that device. But you actually don't need to have an HTML-based prototype to test with assistive tech users and include them in your user research. They can be included at any phase in the product development cycle. So to do research at every stage, here's what to have prepared and what the objective of testing should be at major product milestones. So during the early stages or initial concepts, you have no mockups or low fidelity mockups. And at this point, understand assistive tech users' experiences in similar situations to get an idea of what worked well and what did not. So for a participant with low or no vision, if there are mockups, the research can describe the concept and get their feedback. Ask the question, how do low and no vision users or assistive tech users in general expect to use this? How do they expect it to work? Data collected from this question will help designers to create accessible annotations for design wireframes. Also, at this stage, deeply understand their needs and behaviors to anticipate and ideate for needs and behaviors later on. Moving on to the middle stages, when you might have a mid-fidelity mockup or clickable prototypes, testing should be focused on optimizing labels and alternative text, focus order for keyboard-only navigation, and the order in which things will be presented to a screen reader user as they tab and arrow through a page or user flow. So for screen reader participants, the researcher in this case will act like a screen reader. And at this point, designers, in collaboration with product and research, should have defined the focus order, labeling, and alternative text for images. And the UX researcher would use this information when testing the concept with the screen reader participant. Whoever writes the copy and alternative text should be involved at this stage, as honing these items are not only important for sighted users, but this is the main experience for screen reader users. And then during the end stages, when you have high fidelity prototypes or production or live sites, The main objective at this stage is to ensure things are functional and working smoothly. Really work out the kinks so it is both functional and a joy to use. Now, keep in mind that user research is not used to find bugs. So sometimes it happens as a byproduct, but that should never be the main purpose when doing accessibility research. For developers, try to occasionally observe user research sessions, and I highly recommend this for developers. I hear so often that being able to get a glimpse of the user experience perspective has been so helpful, and them being able to do their job later on. And also, the more context you have, the better you'll understand design specs and user stories when they reach you. And in this way, the development team can begin to prepare functional approaches and solutions. It is also important to remember that users with disabilities are just like general users. They have the same fundamental needs as those who do not have a disability. So for instance, if you work in the fintech space, users with disabilities still want financial security, are concerned about privacy and cybersecurity. They want to feel confident in their financial decisions, just like everybody else. And even take the experience of, a camera and capturing photos. I've done research with people who are blind who love to take photos and videos so that they can share their experiences with their loved ones. So the study objective and analysis will be the same for accessibility as it is for other user research studies. So when conducting user research with participants with disabilities, the same questions that you ask general users will apply. You want to evaluate usefulness, the user satisfaction, ease of use, and task completion. But of course, you'll also want to probe on accessibility specific questions and watch out for accessibility specific issues. And be sure to note barriers to access, such as focus order, focus retention and reading order, keyboard traps, which occur when a user can get into a component or element on a page by using the keyboard, but cannot get out of that component. You'll also want to identify elements with no alternative text or elements with vague descriptions, lack of multiple feedback modalities, and workarounds if the participant was unsuccessful during their first attempt. So for designers, one of the most important things that they can do to design for accessibility is including accessible annotations and mockups and design specs. Now, this is something that can be incorporated right away into design systems and current workflows. So similar to accessibility acceptance criteria, these won't be perfect at first, and they will not cover everything, but start somewhere. Start with areas that you're already familiar with, such as maybe color contrast, and then build from there. Including accessible annotations into design specs also ensures that accessibility is fundamentally considered from the ground up, hand in hand with acceptance criteria. So to do this, you can also rely on, UX research and WCAG guidelines to help you build out your library of accessible annotations. And to create designs with accessibility in mind, designers should meet with the UX researcher to deeply understand user research findings and how to apply those findings. It's kind of similar to when you're handing off design to a developer, is that during any handoff, there's always room for maybe some misunderstanding or misinterpretation or just different perspectives coming in. So it's also important to check in with the researcher on what the finding was. And additionally, there's so many data points that come out of user research study that we can't simply report on every little thing. So always collaborate with your UX researchers, because maybe there's something that wasn't necessarily prioritized in the report at first, but came out of the study that you could still utilize. And then when creating a mockup, consult with developers on the other side of it on the lift and feasibility of the design. When handing off to development, be sure to meet with the developers to review designs and annotations to make sure they understand your design intent. And then lastly, during development, ensure designs are being implemented accurately and as intended. There are 3 types of accessible annotations to include in your specs. The first is page annotations that define the overall flow and structure of a page. So under a page annotation, you'll want to identify the tab order, which is the order in which interactive elements receive focus and are read when tabbing through a page. Reading order, which is the order in which things are read by a screen reader when arrowing through a page. Buttons and links, making sure that you're defining what is a button and what is a link, and the headers and the heading structure. The second annotation is component annotations, and those define the purpose of the element or component with the accessible name. So an accessible name is what a screen reader will read out when a user interacts with that content. So you want to define, what is the role of the element? That's the purpose, what the element does. For the role, you'll need to have some knowledge of HTML and ARIA, but you can also work with developers and lean on them for this. And for some organizations, it might make sense to leave this up to the developer altogether. Under component annotations, you'll also want to define the name, label, or alternative text of the element. And then you'll also want to define the default state of the element, so whether that's focusable or disabled. And lastly, there's interaction annotations, which define what happens when a user interacts with an element. So with interaction annotations, you'll define the focus order and where focus is positioned. You'll define what is displayed and what is hidden, and you'll also define the keyboard functionality overall. So this is an example of what those accessible annotations look like once defined. And of course, actual design specs will have far more detail than this, but it kind of gives you a gist. So here we have the page annotations and a little key here. And as you can see, it's defining the order when someone will tab through the page. It's noting what is a link and what is a button. It's also starting to note what the heading structure is here. We also have the component and interaction annotations for this button, add to wish list button. So we can see here the role has been defined as a button. The name, which is the accessible name, is add to wish list. And the state is focusable, meaning that when someone's tabbing over it, they'll be able to focus on that button. We have the interaction annotations. So here it's specifying for the keyboard that a space or enter basically equals a click. And on click, open add to list modal, and then place the focus on the first header of that modal. So we'll include a couple of references to more detailed annotation examples in the list of resources we'll send after the webinar. Look out for those resources from DQ and from the Figma community. There are a lot of design resources and accessibility requirements, but these are the 4 key areas that a designer working in accessibility should be aware of. This list has been adapted from a number of resources, which we will also include for you after the webinar. Now, I'm also going to speak very briefly on development as well, based on my past experiences collaborating with developers, accessibility engineers, and other members of the product team. And here are my main takeaways for you after doing dozens of heuristic evaluations and helping teams to build accessible experiences. So first, for developers, build designs based on WCAG accessibility success criteria and techniques and using consistent standardized coding practices. Review mockups with designers to understand their design intent and annotations. This also helps you to remove any guesswork, and so that way you can just focus on building an accessible experience that is compatible with assistive technology and accessible features. And then if you run into any difficulty and a design cannot be fully implemented as intended, collaborate with designers to discuss alternative solutions. That way the user's experiences and needs don't get lost in the shuffle. And my expertise is not in development, far from it as a researcher, but here are the main things that I have learned from collaborating with accessibility engineers on heuristic evaluations. So only use ARIA when you need to. Well-structured semantic HTML is the foundation of an accessible experience. But I also am very aware that that's not always possible, especially like when retrofitting accessibility. And so ARIA is perfectly accessible if it doesn't make sense to use semantic HTML, and using semantic HTML would just break the entire experience. Code order is defined by the reading order in design specs, and that should be determined early on before development work even begins. All page functionality must be available via the keyboard alone, and so test everything with your keyboard. Validate your code and continuously test with keyboard-only navigation, automated tools, and screen readers to validate code and ensure color contrast meets minimum WCAG standards. And then lastly, utilize peer reviews to ensure quality and accuracy and to help each other learn and improve your accessibility skills. And then for developers as well, we are going to include some specific development resources after the webinar too. Here are 3 main ones that I have found to be really helpful, or that have been communicated to me as being really helpful for engineers as well. So WebAIM stands for Web Accessibility in Mind, and that is a nonprofit organization based at Utah State University that has provided international web accessibility solutions and resources for over 2 decades. And then DQ is an accessibility consultancy that specializes in development, engineering, and training for developers. And then IBM also has extensive resources and experience with accessibility engineering. All right, so I want to leave you with one final thought. I was driving back home from the gym this morning and I was stopped at a light at a major intersection. Kitty corner to me, I could see a man who was blind walking with a cane to help him identify his surroundings. He was struggling to find the bus stop, and two people were standing at the bus stop and did not look up to offer help. This man finally found the booth to orient himself to then find the beginning of the crosswalk. That bumpy part of the curb that helps those who are visually impaired to know, where they are, that they're about to leave the sidewalk and enter the street. Now, this man was using his stick and waving his arms, listening to traffic to figure out when it was okay to cross, because there was no auditory feedback to let him know when he could walk. So he would try to take a step and then hopped back, realizing that traffic was moving. And I'm still at the light trying to get over to the street and park to offer my help. You should always offer first to offer help to help this man cross the sidewalk. Meanwhile, hundreds of people, because it's a major intersection, are passing by. By the time I get there, luckily someone else finally stops, jumps out of their car and asks to help if this man needs help to guide him across the street. That was one person out of 100 driving by. Two people at the bus stop who did not look up. Accessibility is not just a box to check off. It is not something that should be dreaded or that people feel resentful or reluctant to do. It really is life-changing. Accessibility is the pursuit to remove barriers of use for people with disabilities. Every single human on this planet deserves to live a life of dignity. They deserve to be able to do things independently on their own terms, to feel that sense of self-sufficiency and self-fulfillment. Now, we are particularly well positioned in this industry to address the barriers people with disabilities face. And the work we do is for some of the most powerful and influential companies in the world. So if we don't address accessibility, who will? We have the power to create change. So I'm challenging you to look up, don't hesitate, don't stay in your own lane. If you're ready to really prioritize accessibility and better support these people, and you need help in doing so, reach out to us and let's get to work. All right, so with that, now we'll jump into the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Carly. We've got some great questions here today. I know we're running out of time, so we'll just cover a few. The first question we have is, how do you manage parts of a site that are inaccessible by nature? For example, augmented reality or VR. Is it okay to have parts that aren't critical to the experience that are nice to have, but inaccessible?
Interesting. Yeah, and that's a very good experience. I would actually kind of throw it back and kind of challenge you to ask yourself why it's inaccessible by nature. So usually something is inaccessible just because it wasn't built accessibly. And there are actually a lot of people with motor impairments who really enjoy VR or going into an augmented reality space because it's a form of escapism. We've actually done quite a lot of work here at Answer Lab with participants with disabilities in the gaming and AR and VR space. So there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of possibility to make even these experiences accessible. And then to the second part of that question, is it okay to have certain parts of the experience nice to have? I would say that really the effort should be to make sure that the entire experience is accessible. If for whatever reason you're really running into barriers and something is really, really difficult and you're just having a hard time making something accessible, it's okay to release something as long as you have a mitigation plan in place or a remediation plan in place. So I actually recommend that every company as well also has an accessibility dedicated page with maybe known accessibility issues, to let people know, like, we know this, we're aware, and we're working on it. And then maybe even a link to it saying, like, if you are ever interested in participating in research, sign up here. So the goal should always be to continuously work toward making your experience and product as accessible as possible.
Great. Next question. What are some best practices, do's and don'ts, etc.? How do you achieve accessibility through a design system?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Design systems are so important, and I'm not a designer, so I'm really just going to speak to this from a user research perspective. So one of the things that you can achieve accessibility through the design system, like I mentioned, was the accessible annotations. That is going to be a game changer for designers and for a product development team. The second thing I also want to add is that while design systems and for the most part are extremely helpful, there are some instances when put in a certain context where a particular component of a design system just isn't very useful in a specific context. So it's really important then to kind of lean on user research and figure out the moments where it's okay to maybe like deviate a little bit or have options to deviate. And then additionally, it's also important to be looking at the user research kind of from a meta level as well. So that way, if there's something consistently coming up with the design system across experiences and pages and teams, that's kind of surfaced, and that's where that system in place to surface level and triage issues really comes into play, because then it could be surfaced to those like central teams. So that way they can address it at more of like a higher level.
Great answer. We'll do one more question here. When conducting remote interviews to evaluate accessibility of hybrid digital and/or physical products, what are tips for finding and recruiting participants with specific disabilities, like a vision impairment, as an example?
Yeah, another really great question. So tips for finding and recruiting participants. So as I mentioned, you'll want to kind of focus on or prioritize maybe some key assistive technology groups or disability segments. So for instance, if let's say maybe you had a WCAG assessment done and there's a lot of issues that have been identified that would really affect a screen reader user's experience or keyboard only navigation experience, you can kind of like home in on those particular groups and just recruit for maybe switch device users or upper body motor impairment and screen reader users. And so, you'll craft a screener based on that. And you can work with recruiting partners, vendors. Like I mentioned, you can create an accessibility page, add a link for people to sign up for research. Or of course, you could always work with us, and we can find and recruit those participants and help you out with the research.
Great. Thank you, Carly. So that about wraps it up for today. Thank you so much to our panelists, and thank you for everyone for joining today. If you found this discussion useful or informative, you can follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram. We also produce loads of great content on our Insights blog very regularly on all things UX research. So I'd really encourage you all to check it out. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone again for joining and hope you all have a great rest of your day.